So, now that you understand the basics of creating markers, it's important to learn more specifically how you should work with them. This is an area where we've received a lot of requests for clarification and further explanation. So, this lecture will cover some of the more difficult areas that students typically struggle with. It can be especially difficult to retain a high percentage of markers after you've been reading for an extended period of time. And so this lecture will help us understand how to link markers for longer-term storage. As we mentioned earlier, markers usually come in groups. They can be grouped by similarity, or what's known as the tree data structure, or directly connected with each other in what's called the linked list data structure. There are also more complex structures to group markers for advanced students, but we'll not discuss them right now. What's important is to know that you need some way to effectively link your markers together. By doing this, you create more dense networks of points, memories, or images, and you're more likely to remember them. Let's illustrate this with an example. Suppose you need to go to the local store and buy 20 items. By now, you know well enough to know that you need to create 20 markers, one for each of these important items. But how do you link those items together to ensure that none of them are a single, unconnected memory that would drift off into the sea of your mind? Later on in the course, when we talk about memory palaces, we're going to explain how you can connect all of the memories very quickly and effectively to a physical space or location. But for now, let's think about several other potent strategies for remembering the 20 markers or items on your grocery list. In one example, you can divide or chunk the list into departments: milk products, milk, cheese, and yogurt; meat products, 3 sorts of sausage, chicken breast, and steak, and so on. You could try to visualize the packages you get at each department. Since each package is below 7 items, which is a must for this method, you'll be able to recall the visual image per department with great detail. As we mentioned, this is a lot like a memory palace, but you don't have to worry about all that just yet. In another example, you could make a sort of animation or scene from the markers, and you can imagine your mother milking a cow and preparing cheese from the milk, and then throwing in some jam to make yogurt instead, since your niece has a sweet tooth. Imagine that your niece is missing 3 teeth, and that makes it difficult for her to bite off a chunk of sausage. Then, the niece laughs, she calls your mother a chicken breast, and runs away. She then falls. At the end of the story, your mother puts a frozen steak on the bump on her head. This is a pretty ridiculous story, but it's so ridiculous that you're not likely to forget it or the details in it anytime soon. If we apply this to markers from the last lecture, demonstrating markers, we might get something like Ebenezer Scrooge and King Henry VIII riding an overcrowded carriage with radial wheels through King George's green flower garden on their way to the 1902 World's Fair. That one complex image contains 7 markers, all from the last lecture, and all strung together in an easy-to-remember story. All we have to do is remember this one package of markers, and we remember 7 very specific details about the Garden City movement. By linking these markers in a quick and dirty way into a vividly memorable story or set of chunked images in the first example, you have been able to recall many more markers than you would if you had just made a simple list. Eventually, you should be able to combine both methods. You should not have lists of more than 20 objects, preferably more like 7 to 9, and you should not have chunks of more than 7 objects each. Those should preferably be 3 to 4. But then you can cut open each object and see another list or package within. Each text we read is organized in a similar structure by the internal logic of the text. The text is divided into sections, a section is divided into paragraphs, paragraphs into sequences, and so on. Never try to memorize a marker outside of its context. The markers should be remembered within a package or a story and interconnected to the other markers in that specific area. This is a bit overwhelming, I know, but just bear with me. When you try to remember a list, you should visualize the first and the last item in the list in a little bit more detail than other markers. Then you'll be able to recreate the story both from the beginning and from the end. It's a good idea to practice doing this, actually. Don't spend much time imagining the middle markers, as long as you have a unique mental animation to connect these markers to the markers before and the markers after. When you visualize a package marker, the whole package appears as a marker with each item within the package as a detail of that marker. So think about the jam and the yogurt. Those were details of the overall story we told about your mom and your niece. This visualization is great for the markers that represent physical objects, but it doesn't necessarily work for abstract notions. For abstract notions, you can visualize icons. For example, war is 2 swords. A contract can be a handshake. Peace can be an olive branch, etc. Remember the example I gave of making a marker for genetics versus DNA and the double helix? These abstract notions can be connected by some kind of logical arrow that indicates cause, contradiction, or conclusion. When making package markers, try to avoid inserting information that was not originally in the text, because you'll likely remember that information as well. So, it probably wasn't a great idea to add the carriage in my example before, unless I'm absolutely sure I won't forget that the radial wheels are what matter from the carriage. We really want to make the process as simple and non-ambiguous as possible. It's important that you remember with the different ways of chunking and packaging markers, and different levels of ridiculous markers to determine what is a good fit for you. These tricks of linking and chunking markers will make huge improvements in your ability to retain the markers long term. However, for material that you need to memorize with near 100% efficiency, you can refer to the advanced lecture on memory palaces towards the end of the course.